So I really like this song a lot, and I think that it's far, far superior to the disco remake that the band did years later on the Lei'd album. So
You do you?
yeah, so really
You
cool.
going out on a limb with that?
Yeah, yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Jake, and welcome to the 43rd episode of Good Timin. As always on this podcast, we're going to be talking about one of our favorite bands, the Beach Boys. And on today's episode, we're going to be continuing our late 60s album discussion series and covering the group's 13th studio album, Wild Honey from 1967. So as usual with our album discussion episodes, we're first going to go over a bit of the history behind the record and talk about how it came together. And then we will discuss each of the tracks one by one and share our own thoughts and opinions on them. And then at the end of the episode, we'll also discuss a few outtakes and other recordings that the band made around this time. And then to wrap up, we'll briefly talk about the commercial and critical reception that Wild Honey received. So joining me tonight, I have my good friend Matt, as well as our special guest Steve from the Beach Boys Basement YouTube channel. If you followed the podcast for a while now, you might remember that Steve joined us for our late 60s album draft last season. So it's fitting to have him join us once again to talk about one of the band's 60s albums. So Steve, I'm excited to have you back on the show, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions on Wild Honey. So before we get into some of the history and background surrounding Wild Honey, do you guys have any general thoughts or feelings about the record that you wanted to share?
I really like Wild Honey. I think it's a really nice kind of blue-eyed soul record. So it was a nice change of direction for the group. Now I know that they always were kind of influenced by a lot of black artists and stuff, but this is like probably like one of the first that they really wore that influence on their sleeve. It's a short record, but it's a very charming record. It's got a lot of really good songs on it. Yeah, I just really enjoy Wild Honey. I think it's a really awesome record. So I'm excited to talk about it tonight.
Yeah, it's one of my very favorite Beach Boy albums. It is short, charming, concise, and all holds together as a piece, which I really like about it. Um, I'll say more as we go, but it's
Yeah.
an album. It's one of my very favorite Beach Boy albums.
For me, so Wild Honey is an album that I feel like I connected with relatively quickly. As I mentioned last week, I remember that Smiley Smile and some of the band's other late 60s, early 70s records took quite a while to grow on me, but that wasn't really the case for Wild Honey. I remember really loving songs like Darlin', Aren't You Glad, and Let the Wind Blow pretty much right away after I heard them. And it didn't take very long for a lot of the other material on the album to click with me as well. I think the reason that I enjoy this album so much is that I tend to like a lot of soul and R&B music from the 60s and 70s. And this record is pretty much the Beach Boys trying to capture their own version of that sound. And I think for the most part, they really succeeded. In particular, I think Carl really shines on this album. I really love his soulful vocals on songs like Wild Honey and Darlin'. I also really enjoy the kind of stripped back sound that this album has, which is something that kind of carried over from Smiley Smile. It would also continue on the band's following album, Friends. And then lastly, I just wanted to add that as short as this album is, I actually think that in a way that works to its advantage. None of the songs on here really outstay their welcome. And it's the kind of album you can put on and enjoy without having to put a bunch of time aside to listen to it. So yeah, overall, I really love Wild Honey, and I'd say it's probably my favorite of the group's late 60s records. I'd also say that it's definitely one of my top 10 favorite Beach Boys albums, and I could see myself putting it as high as fifth or sixth on my list of my overall album ranking. So I think this is a really fun album to listen to, and I can't wait to talk about it with you guys tonight. So, all right, so now to get into some of the history behind Wild Honey, I'm going to hand things over to Matt. So, Matt, do you want to talk a bit about where the band was at around the time and how the record kind of came together?
Sure. So, the band had just released Smiley Smile, and as we had discussed in last episode, that album got a very mixed to
Yep.
outright hostile response at the time. Basically, it was just kind of put out like kind of like scrambling together like what they could from some of the Smile material after that whole thing fell apart, and I think it just caught a lot of people by surprise in a bad way. So the band at this point in time was in a real state of limbo because they had that album that was kind of a bit of a disaster. Then they had the whole thing we talked about Monterey Pop that they didn't play, so like they were starting to be seen as like passe and kind of like should they be taken seriously, especially by the emerging rock press that was starting to become a thing around the time. So the band decided to travel to Honolulu and record a live album. Now this album was tentatively called Lei'd in Hawaii. Basically like that album for whatever reason like a lot of things, it just kind of fell apart. So Carl had actually kind of taken some of the initiative with Wild Honey. He started to step more into a role of like kind of producing more of the stuff. Wild Honey kind of was like, they were kind of going for like the Motown Stax record sound. They were trying to kind of almost go back to their roots, I would say, in a little bit. Definitely like this album kind of presaged a lot of like the back to basics styles of records you started seeing out in 68. What also is really cool about this album is that most of the songs on here are going back to the duo of Brian and Mike. So this is really like Brian and Mike kind of coming back into the forte, because we had seen with Pet Sounds, that's primarily Tony Asher, and then Smile, and a lot of Smile stuff was primarily Van Dyke Parks. So this album was, the way I look at this album is it kind of was, like I said, they were trying to like get back to their roots. They were trying to like kind of feel stuff out, trying to try something new, and just kind of like going back to, they're playing pretty much everything in the studio. No more of those like elaborate arrangements, just kind of like a good back to basics, back to roots album for the band. And yeah, so that's kind of the background behind Wild Honey. It came out fairly fast after Smiley Smile 2. So I think they kind of knew that Smiley Smile was a bit of a disaster at the time. So they were, I think, trying to salvage their reputation at the time. And because this came out only three months or so after Smiley Smile, so pretty fast, even by their standards.
Yeah, I kind of view Wild Honey as almost like a reset for the band, where, like you said, Smiley Smile had really kind of flopped and people were just really confused by it. So I think the band just kind of wanted to take a step back and just do something that was a little more accessible. At the same time, though, this album kind of went against the trend at the time. A lot of bands like the Beatles were doing more like psychedelic records around this time, whereas this is more of just a stripped back kind of soul R&B record. So they were definitely kind of going against the times. That might have something to do with why the album kind of struggled a bit commercially. It did do better than Smiley Smile in the US, but it still didn't do great. But that said, there are a lot of really great songs on here. There's a lot of musicians that like this album. I think Jim Morrison said that it's actually was one of his favorites, which is pretty cool that he was listening to this. And like you said, Matt, it kind of has like that stripped back sound, like the previous album, Smiley Smile, kind of to relieve some of the stress on Brian, to do kind of a more back to basics approach. I believe it was recorded at Brian's home studio. And yeah, overall, it's just a really kind of cool stripped back soul and R&B record. And I really enjoy it. So, Steve, did you have anything that you wanted to add in terms of their background behind Wild Honey?
Yeah, I think you guys have done a really nice job in summarizing, the lead into it. And it really struck me as I re-listened to it today that having done Smiley Smile and having it basically flop, go to number 41, where, a year earlier they were disappointed when Pet Sounds went to 10. And then the Lei'd in Hawaii project having fallen through, that it was done hurriedly, I think, to get past that, as you say, a reset. And the thing that is really kind of miraculous is how good it is under those conditions. That the songs are really, those Brian and Mike songs are really solid for something that they put together so quickly, seemingly. And I mean, a few of the tunes had been around for a while, Darlin's a rewrite and that kind of thing. But nevertheless, the fact that it's kind of a small miracle that this thing is as good as it is under the circumstances in which it was made.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. One quote that I wanted to share real quickly from Carl about this album, this is from the mid-70s when Carl said this. He said, Wild Honey was very simply music to cool out by. Brian was still very spaced out, though I seem to recall he'd given up acid by that time, but we all really dug Motown, so Brian reckoned we should get more into a whole white R&B bag. I also recall around that time the band, and Brian in particular, getting criticized very heavily for sounding like choir boys. So you can kind of see like the band almost trying to give off more of a cool look with this album, kind of go against the criticisms that they were receiving. I think it's also worth mentioning that both Carl and Mike were very into like the kind of soul and R&B sound, like Stax Records and artists like Aretha Franklin. So yeah, it really does make sense that the band would eventually get around to doing a soul R&B record like this. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about it with you guys. So all right, so do we want to get into the track by track rundown of Wild Honey now, guys?
Sure.
All right, let's do it. So the opening track, of course, is the title track, Wild Honey. So this is the first of many Brian and Mike compositions on the album, and I think this is a really awesome and soulful rocker. I think it perfectly introduces the record's overall sound. I really love Carl's lead vocal on this. I think he sings the hell out of it, and I think that the strain in his voice also really adds to the soulful sound of the song. One of my favorite parts of his vocal is at the end when he screams, "Suck it to me, wild honey." I really love the on that. Also during the bridge, like the sweeta section, I really like that as well. I also really love the use of electro theremin throughout this song, as well as that cool little organ solo that I think Bruce played during the bridge. I think that they both give the song kind of a psychedelic sound, which I really like a lot. And yeah, overall, I think this is just a really great song from Brian and Mike, and it's one that I honestly really wish had done a bit better as a single in the U.S. I know that it did go top 10 in Australia, which is pretty respectable, but it didn't seem to find as much success in the U.S. and U.K. So it's an awesome song, one of my favorites on the album, and it's definitely my preferred version of the song. I know a lot of people like the live versions from the early 70s with Blondie Chaplin singing, but to be honest, I'm not that crazy about his vocals on this song, so I usually do come back to the original Wild Honey album version sung by Carl. So what do you guys think of Wild Honey?
Pretty much everything you said, actually, you hit on all the points I was going to talk about. I think it's a great way to open off the album. They're kind of going for like that Stevie Wonder Motown vibe, which I think comes across well. Carl does a great job singing it. Electro theremin is nice. I do quite like the Blondie version. I don't know which one I prefer. I kind of like the energy on that one that's in the live one, but as you know, I don't listen to live stuff a hell of a lot. Looking at some of the lyrics, yeah, eat up, honey. I wonder if that's supposed to be like a double entendre. Kind of, I don't really know. Anyway, yeah, I really do enjoy the song. It definitely is a bit of a shame that it only got to 31 on the charts. I think it definitely deserved better than that. But I think it's an awesome song, great way to start off the album. And yeah, everything you said, I agree 100%.
Oh, well, I'm not going to buck the trend because it's a song I love. I love the performance. Carl is so praised for his beautiful vocals on, things like God Only Knows, that he often gets overlooked as a rock vocalist. I mean, he can do it all, and he really, really shows it here. Great track.
Yeah. And Matt, to follow up a little bit on that, the live versions from the early 70s, I do really like the energy of those performances. It's just that sometimes Blondie's vocal, I'm kind of just like, on it. Like it's good, but it's not, to me, it's not Carl's vocal. So I think a little indifferent on it.
His vocals are a little bit more kind of like rough around the edges. So
yeah, exactly.
And some people like that style, and some people prefer like more clean cut. It just kind of comes down to what your personal preference is. Though I think his voice does work on things like obviously like Sail on Sailor and Here She Comes and stuff like that. It's right in his wheelhouse.
Leaving this town too. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So the second track on side one of Wild Honey is Aren't You Glad? So this is another Brian and Mike co-write, and this is also another one of the highlights of the album for me. I really love the bouncy and upbeat verse melody sung by Mike. It's also one of my favorite vocals from Mike, honestly, from this period. It's such a smooth delivery, and it really shows Mike's talents as a vocalist. I also really love the horns that come in during the chorus of this song. I think that they really make it kind of jump out at you more. I saw that Rolling Stone described this song as a Lovin' Spoonful type song with a Beach Boys touch. And I think that's a perfect description of it. To me, it kind of sounds like a mix of like sunshine pop and soul. And I think it's just really done effectively. So really great song, great vocal from Mike. And like I said, really love the horns on this as well. So really great way to follow up the title track, Wild Honey.
This for me is a song that is like beautifully understated in its production because you have like the horns that come in that are like just the right touch. Like you said, like I like how like the melody kind of bounces in there, like it flows really nicely. I do think Mike does do a really good vocal. It's kind of like I wonder like if it's kind of like the vocal. I wonder if he was kind of like having his mouth in a certain way, just because like just the way it's delivered. No, I really do like the song. Yeah, and I kind of like the chorus are a little bit like kind of like, aren't you glad now, darling? It's a little bit more kind of there's a contrast because like I think that the chorus is a little bit more energetic than the verses, but I do like the way it flows. I love the horns. Everything you said, I agree with. Great song. I really, really enjoy it. And so far, we're 2 for 2 on this one.
Well, you're not going to find any dissent here. Actually, I think it would have made a better lead-off single than Wild Honey. I think it should have been the first single.
Yeah, I think that's a fair take, honestly. Yeah, I can see that. To me, it's definitely the most accessible of the non-singles from the album, for sure.
Yeah, and it has a little more polish than some of the other things on it. I'm really surprised it was never an A-side.
All right, so track 3 on Wild Honey is I Was Made to Love Her. So, of course, this is a cover of the popular Stevie Wonder song, which actually had come out only months before the Beach Boys released their own version of this, which I honestly kind of didn't realize until recently. Like, when I was looking up the release dates, I was like, wow, like this literally was only months before the Beach Boys released their own version. So, but yeah, that said, I think this is a really amazing cover, and I think it's a really great fit for Carl's voice as well. Another really soulful lead vocal from him, and I think he really gets across the feeling and emotion of the song. My favorite part of his vocal during this song is at the end when he sings, "If the mountain tumbles, if this whole world crumbles." I always really like his vocal on that. It's so soulful. I also really love the band's arrangement of this song as well, with the bouncy piano and the backing vocals from the guys. The only thing that I might have changed with this cover would have been to maybe include the bridge section from the original Stevie Wonder version. It's like the all through thick and thin section. I know that the Beach Boys did attempt to record that section because you can find an alternate recording of the song on the Sunshine Tomorrow set where they have that kind of tagged on at the end a little bit sloppily. But I would have liked to have heard what it would have sounded like if it had actually been fully incorporated into the song. Besides that, though, I think this is an awesome cover. It's definitely one of my favorite covers that the Beach Boys ever did, and it's one of the highlights of the album for me as well. So, really great soulful song.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty well done cover. I think Carl sings it very well. I wonder how Stevie Wonder felt about it. I know he's a big Beach Boys fan, so I'm sure he was probably flattered that they did this song, and I'm sure he would have not objected to the extra royalties. I don't know how many he got from it, but he did co-write the song, so he got some money from it. Yeah, no, I think it's a really well done cover. I know that they have often, not often, but there was I think Kreisgau made a point one time where he felt like the Beatles were like the ones that did like covers of black artists the best. Like he felt like the Beach Boys just didn't really compare in a lot of respects, but I do think that they do a very tastefully done cover of the Stevie Wonder song here, and I really, really enjoy it. Yeah, it's a pretty top tier cover from them.
Yeah, they were really good about what they chose to cover in the 60s and how they covered it, that they really almost always made it their own.
Mm-hmm.
And they did so here too, without changing it dramatically. You know, it's stripped down and Beach Boy-esque, but not a radical rewrite either. But it's enough that they've made it their own. I'm always impressed at their choice and how well they brought it into their genre, their style.
Mm-hmm.
All the covers that they did, nearly all the covers that they did in the 60s, and this one right along with it.
Yeah. I think you know a cover's good when you listen to it and you don't immediately think like, oh, I really want to hear the original right now. And
Yes.
this cover, like I just view it as just a really great Beach Boys performance. Like I know it's a Stevie Wonder song, but like I love this version so much that I come back to it more than the Stevie Wonder version, which is also great. But yeah, I love it. And I think Carl really makes it his own with his vocal on this. So really great song.
And their versions, the Beach Boys version's easier to sing along with somehow.
Yeah.
I can understand the words a little better somehow.
Yeah. Stevie Wonder is a hard artist to cover because he's so stylized. Any stylized artist like that is always going to be tough to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to say I'm a little bit surprised they never did this song live. I think they would have done a great job like performing this one in concert with Carl on lead. I mean, even in the 70s, I feel like they could have brought this back and did it. I think really great. So I wish there was a recording of that somewhere.
They should have about the sunshine of my life. I want to hear that.
Oh yeah, that would be cool too. All right, so track 4 on Wild Honey is Country Air. So this is a really cool track. I love the kind of like off-kilter sound of the piano on this one. It gives this song almost like an unsettling, intense feeling, which I really like. Lyrically, it's a pretty simple song. It's just one verse repeated multiple times. But yet I think the song still manages to be pretty interesting and memorable. I especially love the group harmonies during the verse section and the whistling throughout the song as well. I think that that's a pretty fun touch. But yeah, I think it's a very cool track, and it's one that I think Brian seems to be pretty proud of because he's called it his favorite track on the album before as well. So I really like this one a lot. I think it's a very cool deep cut.
Yeah, this has a very interesting ambience to it where it kind of like almost feels like you're like in the middle of nowhere and you're just like on a farm somewhere and just get a breath of that country. Yeah, it's a pretty simple song, but I think it's a very evocative track. I really do enjoy it, and it's a good breather right after I think it's a good like come down from like you have like the raucous energy of I Was Made to Love Her, and then you have this that's a little bit more soothing, but also like you said, a little unsettling. I really do enjoy it. I think it's a pretty nice cut.
Yeah. I think that off-kilter piano and the whistling give it a little bit of a psychedelic feel.
Yeah.
Without going full psychedelia. It sounds very, modern for its time in a very subtle way.
Yeah, I think as a whole on this album, like even though like people have said like, oh, this album goes against like the psychedelia of the time, like what a lot of bands are doing, like the Beatles. At the same time, like there's definitely those little touches of psychedelia throughout the album, like you said, Steve. Like I think of like on Wild Honey, like that organ solo and just the use of the electrotheremin. Like to me, that's a very kind of psychedelic sound. On this song, like you said, and on a couple of the other ones we're gonna get to as well. There's like these little touches of psychedelia, which I think really add to the songs. So yeah, I think it's really cool.
What's funny is that they're kind of going to like an R&B bluesy kind of sound, and then the Rolling Stones right around the same time release their psychedelic album, their Satanic Request.
Right. Yeah. All right, so side one of Wild Honey closes with A Thing or Two. This song definitely took some time to grow on me. I've always found the verses to be pretty catchy and fun, and I think that Mike and Carl give some really great vocals as well. But the chorus used to not do too much for me. I thought it just felt very abrupt, and it didn't really seem to fit in with the verses of the song. That said, it has grown on me quite a bit over time, and when I re-listened to it today, I was honestly pleasantly surprised how much I enjoyed the song. I still wouldn't say it's one of my favorite tracks on the album, but I've definitely come around on it more over time, and it is a song that I will listen to outside the context of the album. So I think it's a cool track. Like I said, really like the verse melody, like the "Lucky I'm working from 9 to 5." I really think that's catchy, and I also think it's interesting that the band reused the chorus melody part, like the "Do It Right, Baby." They reused that and do it again the following year, like the dun 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 dun. So I think that's really cool as well, that kind of originated from this song. So what do you guys think of A Thing or Two?
It's probably my least favorite on side one, but that's not really saying much because everything so far has been really strong. I think I kind of have not really a problem, but I think I have the same thoughts that you do, where it's like I do like the verses, but I think the problem is that like the song is almost a little like incongruent to me, because it's like the verses are like kind of like soft, but then all of a sudden the choruses kind of get loud, like "Do it right, baby." It's like almost like it's like it almost sounds like two different songs smushed together.
Yeah.
Having said that, I do like that organ or whatever sound that is like going throughout the chorus, and then I kind of like the like that, I don't know what it is, but like that kind of like twinkling sound that's like in the verses, that's like you kind of hear behind like Mike's vocal. I like the vibe. I don't know that, but whatever it is, I like that. I do like the song, but I think that it's just a little on the incongruent side for me, just because like there's such a jarring contrast between like the verses and the chorus. But I guess it makes it stick out.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's easily my least favorite on the side, but again, it's an album that I love, so I'll take it. And it is that jarring change of tempo between the verses and the chorus, and I prefer the verses. I'm right there with you guys on it.
Yeah. I mean, that is kind of how to this day I still kind of feel that way about it, but it just has grown on me more, where I kind of just view it as like just kind of the weirder piece. Kind of like I saw some music critic or somebody compared it to like Getting Hungry, like saying like, oh, this album's Getting Hungry, where like that song also has kind of those abrupt transitions. On here though, it definitely feels a bit less jarring to me than it did on Getting Hungry, which I'm still not a fan of. But yeah, I think it's a cool track, and I do think it's placed well in the album. I think it's good that Kiss kind of ends the side. It's not like, it doesn't open a side or it's right in the middle. So I think it's fine where it's placed.
It definitely
It strikes me that the first time I heard it, I think was shortly after the first time I heard Cabanescence. So you want jarring changes. It paled in comparison to the changes on Cabanescence.
Yeah.
This is definitely better than Getting Hungry.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so now we will flip the record over and start side two. So kicking off side two, we have Darlin'. So not only is this my favorite song on Wild Honey, but this is also one of my favorite songs in the entire Beach Boys catalog. I love pretty much everything about it. The super catchy and upbeat melody, Carl's really soulful lead vocal, the use of horns throughout the song, and the great backing harmonies during the chorus as well. I think it's just a perfect song, and I can see why it's both the most well-known track from the album and also the one that has been performed live the most over the years. It's definitely a concert pleaser, and it's one of their most rocking and energetic songs. So I think it's really great. And this is one of those ones, like, it's crazy to me that Brian was initially planning on giving this song away. I think he was going to give it to the group Redwood, which was the group that became Three Dog Night. And then I think Carl kind of talked some sense into him and was like, no, like, we need to focus on the Beach Boys, you know? And I think the same thing happened with Time to Get Alone as well, which he was also going to give to Redwood. So I'm really glad that the Beach Boys decided to record this song because I think it's one of the highlights of their catalog. And I think, like one of you guys alluded to, I think, Steve, you mentioned it, this song, part of the melody was pulled from an earlier Brian composition. I think it was Thinking About You Baby, I think it was called.
Yeah.
Kind of an obscure record, but this is definitely a big improvement on it. So I'm really glad that Brian reused the melody. So what do you guys think of Darlin'?
Yeah, I think it's one of their best singles. I think it's a great way to start off side two. I actually think this is what I think should have been the lead single. I know that this did better on the charts. This got to number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 11 in the UK. So definitely an improvement. It kind of is like a nice, like, I think we talked about before. I think this one also has kind of a bit of a sunshine pop vibe. I could definitely, see like some of those artists doing it. Carl's vocal is awesome. I love the live version that they did. I think it's the DC one where like Dennis is just killing it on the drums. Yeah. I think he's awesome. This song actually, so a couple more background pieces, or not back, but extra info about these songs. This song, there was a duo, a French rock band actually by the name of Darlin'. They took their name from this song.
Oh.
And, they got a review of some of their early stuff, and it was called a Daft Punky trash. Well, two of those members later broke off and became, of course, Daft Punk, one of the most influential EDM duos ever. So that's kind of cool. This song was also featured in The Big Bang Theory. I'm not a huge fan of that show, but I think it's kind of cool that they kind of brought this show. The show kind of brought this song to a bigger audience. That's always awesome. And one last thing I want to add is that apparently Brian said this was in 2015 his favorite song ever written because he just liked the melody. But Brian, depending on what interview you cite, it's a bit different. Yeah. I always thought California Girls was the one that he thought was his best, because I know he said that one for years. But I mean, I think it's a great song. I think it's a great song. I think it's one of their best singles, period. And I think it's a great way to start off side two.
Yeah, there are some songs with any band, including the Beach Boys, that you hear so much that it's hard to hear them with fresh ears. You just can't hear them the same way. But there are a few that still do it for me every time. I Get Around is one, and Darlin' is one. It just gets me every time. And it's always a highlight in concert. I mean, that's when I think about the best Beach Boy concert experiences I ever had, I picture him playing Darlin'.
Yeah. It's one of those songs that just feels like it was made for the stage, and hearing Carl sing it live, like on the Live in Concert album from 1973. Also like Nebworth, just really flying through it, like just super high tempo energy. That killing it on the drums, like Matt mentioned. Just really great live song and really great on the album as well. So awesome song. All right, so the next track on side two of Wild Honey is I Love Just Wants to See You. So this is a fun little acoustic song from Brian. This one kind of reminds me a bit of some of the songs that he would write on the band's following album, Friends, specifically Busy Doing Nothing. I like the kind of laid-back sound and lyrics of this song, where you have Brian kind of singing about washing the dishes and asking some girl when she last baked him a pie. It's kind of like those like slice of life lyrics, which are pretty fun. Of course, the most memorable and funny lyric in the song, though, is the last line where he sings, I love just wants to see you in the nude, which is totally random and out of nowhere. But I also think that it kind of shows Brian's quirky sense of humor, which I can appreciate. Musically, I also really like the middle section of the song with the ba 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 backing vocals. That little part has always, this might just be me, but that little part has always reminded me a little bit of the backing vocals in the song Who Loves the Sun by the Velvet Underground, which actually came out a few years after this song. So I'm curious if there was possibly any influence there, if they'd been listening to this album. So it's maybe not one of my absolute favorite songs on Wild Honey, but I do still think that it's pretty fun, and I really like the stripped back sound of it. So definitely a fun album track.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think you hit the nail on the head. Fun album track. It's got the nice cheeky sense of humor. I was gonna say too, it kind of has that bossa nova-y vibe that you would hear on like Busy Doing Nothing on the next album. This is almost kind of like a pseudo Busy Doing Nothing, I would say, in a little bit of ways, kind of like Set in the Ground. As far as Velvet Underground goes, Lou Reed was a Beach Boys fan. Now I don't know if he was listening to this album in particular, because that Who Loves the Sun, that's on Loaded, right?
That's on Loaded, which I think came out like 1970.
Yeah, so Loaded was kind of like the album that like he was intentionally trying to write hits. So I don't know if he was necessarily citing this out, but I do know that Lou Reed was a big Beach Boys fan. He, God Only Knows, was one of his all-time favorite songs, and he said something once like "There is no God and Brian Wilson is his son." So he held the Beach Boys in very high regard. I always thought "Sunday Morning" actually sounded like it could have been a Beach Boys song, the opening track on Velvet Ground and Nico. Anyway. Yeah, no, I think it's a fun little cut. I don't think it's like the best song on the album by any stretch of the means, but it's a nice little breezy tune. A lot of fun to listen to, and the last lyric always gets a smile on my face.
Yeah, I like the slice. I like Brian's slice of life lyrics. You kind of have to know something about Brian, I think, to really appreciate it. You know, it helps to have a little background on who he is. He certainly expresses who he is in it. The last line, I always thought, had the possibility of sinking the song and just turning it into a joke, and it doesn't do that. It actually is a nice, it's not so overwhelming as to sink the song, which it could possibly have done if it was not a better track. And it's funny, the bop bop boss, I never associated that with Velvet Underground, but I can really see what you're saying. I always thought Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66, but a little more of a stripped down version of that. Like they were just doing sort of an off the cuff Sergio Mendes Brazil 66 ba ba ba. But that's a really good line that you draw from this to Velvet Underground. That's really interesting. I can definitely hear it now that you've mentioned it.
Yeah, like in that song, I think the backing vocals, it's like ba 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 ba, and in this it's like ba 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 ba. So it's like a very similar part. So I'm just curious, it's one of those subconscious things, you know, where maybe you'd heard this song and that you just used that. But it is interesting to me how similar they sound. So
yeah, that's really good.
I need to ask my dad about Sergio Mendes. He's from Brazil. I asked my dad about Bossa Nova once. He's like, "Oh yeah, Bossa Nova." I'm like, "Yeah."
All right. So the next track on the album is "Here Comes the Night." So this song is honestly another one of my favorite deep cuts on Wild Honey, along with the following track in the album, which we'll talk about next. In terms of Here Comes the Night, though, I really love the catchy and upbeat verse melody sung by Brian, and the fun lyrics by Mike. Lyrically, this song actually reminds me a little bit of A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles, in that they're both kind of about waiting to get home to see your lover after a long day, and then the things you'll do with them when you see them. This song also has a kind of unexpected chorus that almost sounds a little bit like unsettling and tense to me. I'm not like somebody that's like big on music theory, but apparently the reason why it sounds so unsettling is that the song loses its tonal center in the chorus, and it uses this really weird kind of chord sequence that isn't supposed to work. That said, I think that Brian did manage to make the song work, and I think that the intense sound of the chorus works really well with the kind of like carnal lyrics during that section. So I really like this song a lot, and I think that it's far, far superior to the disco remake that the band did years later on the Lei'd albums. So
you do you?
Yeah, so really cool.
Going out on a limb with that?
Yeah. But yeah, really fun song. I like it a lot, and it's one of the deep cuts I come back to the most from this era of the band. So what do you guys think of Here Comes the Night?
Yeah, definitely better than the disco thing. I don't know what the hell that was supposed to be. But you make a really interesting point about like how like the song does have a little bit of an unsettling vibe. I also think what also helps this song for me is the way that Brian sings it, almost with like some aggression, like "hold me, squeeze me." Like I think like he has a really cool, like kind of aggressive vocal from on it, which is you don't really think of Brian doing vocals like that, but it sells the song well. And then you mentioned A Hard Day's Night, and then you said lyrically, I'm like, okay, good, because melodically this sounds nothing like he's never the melody. I'm like, I don't know what you're listening to. This is not Harday's Night. But lyrically, no, you're right. Like thematically, yes, they are very similar. But yeah, I really do enjoy the song. I think it's a really nice deep cut. I will say though, I do think the next song, that's probably my favorite song on the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that the performance on this sounds like he sounds like he's really enjoying singing it. I mean, there's an enthusiasm. Maybe it's sort of a carnal thing, but there's a real enthusiasm thrown into it that really makes it. And yes, I like it better than the disco version. So.
You'd be surprised that version has its defenders. Our buddy Nate, who joins the podcast, he likes it quite a bit. So
yeah, well, I can enjoy it now as a time capsule. At the time when we were in the middle of disco, which I remember well, and the Beach Boys were going disco, we thought this could be the tip of the iceberg, that they would then just redo their whole catalog disco. And so it was really like, oh my God, don't go down that road.
Yeah.
But now that it's in the past and it's, it's fun as a time capsule.
Yeah. What were you
But
gonna
this
say?
one, I'll still listen to this one all the time.
I was gonna say that like I feel like when it comes to disco, like I think like if they had just made it campier and like just ridiculous, like it could work. Like I always think of like when Donna Summer sings MacArthur Park, like it's the most ridiculous lyrics, but she knows that and she owns it. I mean, seriously, someone left the cake out in the rain. I can't take it because it took so long to bake it. I'll never have that recipe again. Not exactly Pulitzer Prize winning lyrics, but she sells it because she knows how freaking ridiculous it is. Like the problem I have with the Disco Comes Night is like they're almost like taking it like seriously, and it's too long. So whatever. I mean, I've maybe heard the whole thing twice in my life because every time I listen to that, I might just skip it.
Yeah.
Whatever's next.
Yeah. My favorite part is the random monkey noises that come in halfway through the song.
Yeah, like I always thought like, and like I know like Justin had mentioned like they're using like the people on Michael Jackson's Off the Wall, and I'm thinking to myself, well, that album is a masterpiece, so I don't know what the hell happened here.
I don't know what they were doing. Yeah. All right. So the next track on Wild Honey is Let the Wind Blow. So like I mentioned earlier, this is another one of my favorite deep cuts on the album. Like several of the other tracks, it has kind of a haunting and unsettling sound to it, which is also kind of reflected in like the melancholic lyrics as well, like the "Don't take her out of my life." But yeah, it's a very moving ballad. I really like the sparse arrangement and the vocals from Mike, Carl, and Brian. My favorite part of the song, though, is definitely the bridge. The "Let the bees make honey, let the poor find money, take away their sorrow, bring them sunshine tomorrow." I think that's a really great part, really great words from Mike. And in general, I honestly think that most of the lyrics on this album as a whole are pretty strong. I think Mike did a really great job of kind of like capturing the vibe of each of these songs well with the lyrics. But yeah, "Let the Wind Blow" is an amazing song, one of my favorites from this entire era of the band and their entire catalog. So amazing track, amazing deep cut.
Probably my favorite song on the album. You must be reading my mind today because you're saying everything I'm going to say. But yes, I I think that the lyric "Let the bees make honey, let the poor find money, take away their sorrows, give them sunshine tomorrow." That may be like in my top 10 Beach Boys lyrics. I think it's just brilliantly written. And I think that I know a lot of people like shit on Mike and he doesn't write really good, but I thought he did a pretty good job there. It's simple. It's effective. It has a lot of meaning, and Carl sings, right? Carl just sings the hell out of it. I just think the song in general is very well sung. I think, like you mentioned, the sparse arrangement works well here because it lets the vocals and the harmonies kind of be the forefront of it. A very moving song. Absolutely adore this song, and yeah, I definitely think it's one of their best deep cuts, and it's probably my favorite song on Wild Honey.
Yeah, great track, great lyrics. And, the lyrics are good through this whole album, really. The songwriting's solid through the whole thing. Again, for something that they, seemingly put together quickly to stop the bleeding after Smiley Smile, boy, they came up with some really good stuff. And it's a great track. When I talked about Beach Boys concert on my channel a while back, I heard from so many people saying that "Let the Wind Blow" is their favorite track on that album, Beach Boys Concert. It's a well-loved track, and that's understandable.
Yeah, I really enjoy both versions. I know we did an episode recently on the In Concert album from '73, and I remember our pal Riley on here. He actually said that he wasn't that crazy about their version of the song on that album, or I think it was either him or Nate who said that. But I personally really like both versions. I think that they did a great job of kind of remaking the song for like this early '70s kind of concert sound. I think that it translates very well. But I really like this original Wild Honey version too. Another one of those songs that I think really like benefits from like the kind of like slightly out of tune piano. I think it gives the song a real atmosphere, which I really like a lot. And like you guys mentioned, great vocals from Mike on the verses and from Carl on the bridge. So amazing song.
I think this is also one of those songs that's so well constructed that like you can kind of rearrange and it can like do well.
Yeah. Something interesting I just recently learned, like researching before this episode, is that apparently, this is according to a couple of Beach Boys experts, Mike kind of like had like the gist of this song written down. Like he wrote down, like he came up with all the lyrics and stuff. And I guess he already kind of had like a version of this song assembled. And then Brian took it and rearranged it into what it became as "Let the Wind Blow" and "Wild Honey," which I thought was really interesting because, normally you'd think, it starts with Brian and then Mike sits down with them and, adds the lyrics as they go, maybe contributes a melody here and there. But it's interesting that like Mike kind of presented most of the idea for this song and the lyrics to Brian, and then Brian kind of like worked it out. I think that that's really cool. So
Well, I also think, like if you need proof that Mike can write a song by himself, Big Sur.
yeah, right there.
That outtake that's on Feel Flows, like the very like dream poppy one. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, yeah, that's a great song. So I don't care.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so only 2 tracks left on the album. The first is How She Boogalooed It, which is one of my favorite Beach Boys song titles, by the way. So this song is notable in that it's one of the band's first original songs that doesn't feature any contributions from Brian. It's just credited to Mike, Bruce, Alan Carl, who also sings the lead vocal. And this is another one of the songs that took some time to grow on me. I never disliked it, but it just didn't really do too much for me for a while. However, over time, I've come to enjoy the song quite a bit. I think Carl gives it a really gritty and soulful lead vocal. And I also really like the energetic guitar playing and that really cool organ solo from Bruce. I think that adds a lot to the song. Again, kind of gives it like a bit of a psychedelic vibe towards the end of the track. Maybe not the most musically interesting or complex song in the album, but I do think that it's pretty fun. And I like how kind of wild and loose the band sounds on this one. Just so much energy to it. So cool track, and definitely a solid like first effort in terms of like a non-Brian song from the group. So.
Yeah, first of all, like this is a song that it took me years to realize who the hell was actually singing it because I thought it was Al I didn't know who it was.
Yeah.
Similar. This is a song that I've always just been kind of okay on. I respect it for like the frenetic, forensic energy it has going, but I can't understand a damn thing that's being sung, first of all. And I just think like melodically it doesn't do a whole hell of a lot for me, but I can at least appreciate, like you mentioned, the organ or whatever that is at the end. It kind of has like that psychedelic vibe and the like
I love that so much. SOCK.
Yeah, the sock it to me part, which first time I ever heard that on a song was on Prince's Daddy Pop. And the way it's sung is like this girl's like, ooh, sock it to me. And I was playing it one time around my sister's like, what are you doing listening to this? I'm like, it's Prince. What do you expect? Yeah, I kind of appreciate like the energy they're going for. And like you said, it's kind of cool to hear something that doesn't have Brian on it. But as the song as a whole has never really done a whole hell of a lot for me. Having said that, I don't hate the song and I will listen to it in the context of the album, but I wouldn't choose to put it on by itself.
Yeah, it's wild and loose, and it's very much of its time, especially with "Sock It To Me," which was the big laugh-in catchphrase, and how the boogaloo, and it's very, very 67, 68. But it fits the overall theme. I'm happy to have it there. It's not a highlight, but I mean I enjoy the sort of ramshackle fun of the thing.
Yeah, in particular, I really like Carl's part, like the couples over in the corner romancing and out of the side dancing, which is another lyric the Beach Boys seem to really like from this time. I think Out of Sight, they say that in quite a few songs as well.
This is probably like arguably the most 60s song they ever did. Out of Sight and Sock It To Me. And now I'm just thinking of like
just the title of the song too. Yeah, how she boogalooed it. Yeah.
Like, Nixon on laughing like Sock It To Me, like how he says it.
All right, so Wild Honey closes with the track Mama Says. So this is like an a cappella kind of chant pulled from Vegetables from the Smile Sessions. It's like a fragment of that song. I think this little section works fine as part of that song, but on its own, it doesn't really do anything for me, and it honestly just feels kind of pointless. I do like the little poof part at the end. I think that that's kind of a fun little way to close the album. But that's about it in terms of the appeal of this track for me. Easily my least favorite song in Wild Honey, and it's also the only track that I never come back to outside the context of the album. So, I mean, I'm glad it's at the end. So like you've said before, Matt, it's one of those tracks you can just like lift the needle if you don't want to listen to it. You don't have to like skip it. But I do think it's a bit of an underwhelming closer, which it seems like the band seemed to have kind of a difficult time of ending their albums strong because the following album I don't think ends particularly strong either. But yeah, I think it's okay, but I could do without it.
Well, thank you for reminding me of the closer on the next album because I just remember what it is. Yeah, mercifully, they got very smart with sequencing here because they put the 2 worst songs on each side at the very end. So like you said, like I've said many times, you can just stop the record. Yeah, it just doesn't. I have the same problem with this that I had when we talked about it last week with You're Welcome. It's a fragment. It's a fine fragment, but it's a fragment. It's not really a fleshed out song. I guess it's okay as a closer. It's certainly, you could certainly do a lot worse than this, but it's just kind of like, as it just doesn't really stand alone by itself. It works better as like a whatever you call it. Like I know it's in vegetables. I don't know what you call it, but a part of vegetables. What also is very weird is that Mike got a songwriting credit for this, but not Van Dyke Parks, which is weird.
Yeah, that's pretty unexplainable. I don't know why.
I don't think Van Dyke really cared enough to go fight
No.
for it. He's too busy doing his own record around this time. But yeah, it's just, it is what it is. I wouldn't even really consider it much of a song, honestly. I consider it more like a fragment.
I don't know when it became commonly known that it was a piece of a Smile recording. Because
Probably
I
not.
wasn't aware of that for until the 90s, maybe.
When did the first
The other, Cool Cool Water and Surf's Up and Cabanescence, all those were heavily advertised as being from Smile. And this really, I never heard that it was part of Smile for the longest time. And I'm not sure that was, I'm not sure whether that was generally known or whether that was just something that I missed.
Mm-hmm.
But Smile was so mysterious in those days.
Yeah.
It's okay as a little tag. I just as soon have it there as not. They do have a thing about not wanting to close strong on their albums often. So, like, with this, side 2 of Today, like we've created this great effect, and now let's puncture it because we don't want to be seen to be pompous, or I don't know what it is. But yeah, they like to go out with a whimper instead of a bang, and and they did it again here.
Yeah, well, Riley will defend Bull Sessions with the Big Daddy to the end, which whatever, he can die on that. I was gonna say, I think Pet Sounds ends strong with Caroline, no, but
no, I mean there are exceptions. Yeah, I mean,
now that I think about it, you're right, because you have The Shift, you have Finders Keepers.
Oh, I kind of like Finders Keepers.
Boogie Woody, yeah, no,
yeah. Well, I think in those days it was very much, in the early days it was very much you put the strong songs first and just let them, get weaker and weaker till the end. They weren't really thinking of the album as a full experience. It was like, the A side and B side of the single, and then the next week songs as they went, more or less.
That, and also too, the whole thing about vinyl is that the closer you get to the inner groove, the worse it's going to sound, especially back in those days. So you wanted to put your hit song front so it would sound the best.
That's true too.
Yeah. To be honest, I almost wish like this song was almost included as like a little hidden bonus thing at the end and wasn't even listed as a track. I almost feel like I could I'd be fine with it more if it wasn't actually like, okay, this is the last song on the album. Like it's actually listed on the record, and then you listen to it and it's just like this little a cappella chant. Where like if they had just kind of tagged it on at the end without saying anything, it just says, okay, this album ends with How She Boogalooed It, and then you had this little surprise at the end. I don't think I'd really mind it as much, but I think like viewing this as like this is the album closer, I don't think it's great. So
you're saying it should have did what the Beatles did when Abbey Road came out in the UK and nobody knew Her Majesty was on it.
Her Majesty, exactly. All right, so that is it for the track-by-track rundown of Wild Honey. There are a few outtakes from this period, so I've divided them into two separate kind of categories. We have the original outtake, so the songs that the band was working on around this time that were actual Beach Boys written songs, and then some of the covers that they had recorded. So we'll start out with some of the originals. So the main songs that were being worked on around this time that weren't featured on Wild Honey were Can't Wait Too Long, which we talked about quite a bit on our previous episode, so we won't go too much into that today. Time to Get Alone, Cool Cool Water, Honey Get Home, and Lonely Days. So before I talk about those songs, do you guys have any opinions on any of those original tracks that you have heard?
Sure. I listened to it, I took notes. Time to Get Alone. I love the version on 2020. It might be my favorite song on there. It's certainly up there. This one is an interesting mix. I kind of like I like the whistling bridge with the sleigh bells and the horns. But the lyrics I don't think are as fleshed out for me compared to the 2021, and it's missing by far the best part of the song. And you know what part of the song I'm talking about, right?
Deep and Wide.
Wide. So it's interesting to hear it in an early state, but yeah, it definitely pales in comparison to the 2020 mix, 100%. Cool Cool Water, kind of the same problem I have. It's a bit more repetitive because it's just like the two parts. It's just the water, 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 then cool, so cool. So it's not totally fleshed out. So like when you compare it to the version that closes Sunflower, that's more fleshed out. That's a full song. Now, admittedly, I've never been the biggest fan of that song. It has grown on me. But this is again, it's like it's cool to hear it in an early state, but not fleshed out enough for me. Honey Get Home, a nice instrumental. I like how piano sounds on it, I like how the drums sound on it, but it wasn't fleshed out enough because it's just instrumental in this state. I know there's an AI version of it. We all know how I feel about AI, so and finally, Lonely Days. Again, a nice starter. I like that it's kind of like a duet between Carl and Bruce. The vocals sound good. I like the way the keyboard sounds on it. It is nicely produced. It just needed to be finished.
Yeah.
So like everything, I feel like all of these, in my opinion, sound kind of like they're in a state of not being done. It sounds like they kind of started it and just either stopped or they picked it up later. So they're interesting to hear as like curiosities, but I wouldn't consider any of these essential listening, at least in my opinion.
Yeah. Steve, any thoughts on these tracks?
Yeah, no, I mean, they knew what to leave off. I mean, those things weren't finished, and holding them back for, certainly Cool Water and Time to Get Alone was definitely the right call. I would have hated to have seen them, put them out in that form, and then we don't get the finished form on 2020 and on Sunflower.
Yeah, immediately becomes worse if you
knew what they were doing.
Yeah.
This is the one time they knew what they were doing, because sometimes they threw stuff out and then you listen to it, you're like, what the hell were they thinking?
Oh yeah, they true. Well, like the Smile album.
Well, that, and then also just like I Do, and Wouldn't It Be Nice to Live Again, and all this other stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, especially later, particularly as they got a little further down the line and band politics got into it.
Yep. Yeah, in terms of
it became who could yell loudest, or as Dennis said, who had an alimony payment due.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah, in terms of these tracks, not too much to say about them that you guys haven't said already. I do like how Time to Get Alone has kind of more of like that Wild Honey sound, like with the piano. But like you said, Matt, it's clearly not as strong as the 2020 version. It's missing my favorite part as well. So I'm glad that they didn't release it in that form, and I'm really glad that Brian didn't give it away to Redwood. Cool Water, again, like you said, it's not done. It seemed that one part sounds really good. I don't know if they reused any elements of this original recording in the final Sunflower version. I'd have to do some research on that. But it sounds good, but it's clearly not done. And then Honey Get Home, it's interesting little backing track, but also not a completed song. And Lonely Days, I think it had some potential, and it's cool to hear Bruce sing such a prominent lead part at the start. But it's also clearly not done. So it's cool to hear some projects that the band were working on around this time, but I definitely think that they picked the right tracks to make the album for sure. And then moving on to the covers. So after the Lei'd in Hawaii thing kind of failed, and we'll get a little bit more into that after this. But after that failed, I think the band attempted to kind of re-record some of these covers just in like a studio form, like they just recorded them at the studio. So some of these covers that they did were The Letter, which is by the Box Tops. Mm-hmm. I like this cover quite a bit. I think that it suits Carl's voice really well, and I do honestly just like the song in general, so I'm not surprised that I like the Beach Boys version. I do definitely prefer the Box Tops version with Alex Chilton singing, and I can see why this was not included on Wild Honey. I actually believe this was listed, like when Capitol first announced like a track list for this album. I think this actually was included on there. It might have been one of the live versions they did in Hawaii. I'm glad that it wasn't included. I think the album already has a cover with I Was Made to Love Her. So I feel like I can kind of see why this was left off. But it is a cool cover, and I'm glad that I can listen to it now on streaming. The Game of Love, this is another cover. This one doesn't do a whole lot for me. I can see why it remained in the vault, just kind of there. And then the band also covered With a Little Help from My Friends by the Beatles, which is interesting because it had just recently come out. Bruce sings lead on this, which is pretty interesting. And honestly, it doesn't totally sound like Bruce. Like, it is Bruce, but there's parts of it where like it's not totally recognizably Bruce. But I think the Beach Boys do a pretty solid job with this. I do really like the vocal harmonies during the bridge, like the Do You Need Anybody? I really like, you can hear Carl really prominently on that, which I like. But it's a neat recording, but I can see why they didn't really end up doing anything with this. I don't think it would have fit on an album, and I think I feel like they probably would have got criticized for covering a Beatles song that had just recently come out, and doing what is clearly an inferior version of it, even though it is pretty nice. So what do you guys think of some of these covers that the band was doing around this time?
I do like The Letter. That's Carl? I always thought that was Brian. Is it Carl?
I believe that is Carl.
Interesting. I thought it was Brian.
Yeah, because when they did it live, I know for sure it was Carl in Hawaii. So
comments said Brian, what do you know? But anyway, I do like that cover. I think it's pretty good. I know Alex Chilton was a big Beach Boys fan, and I already know your feelings on his cover of that one song, so I won't even bring that up.
Honking down the highway. Yeah. Hey, I love Big Star. I think Big Star is a great band, but yeah, not a big fan of his cover of Honking Down the Highway.
I do like the cover of the letter. I do think it's very tastefully done. And I actually would have not minded hearing this on an album. This and With a Little Help of My Friends actually first showed up on that Rarities album in '83. Speaking of With a Little Help from My Friends, a nice take on it. Yep,
Mhm.
right there. A nice take with a terrible cover art, but what else? It's almost
Oh man,
was that other one, Jake? Sunshine Tomorrow? Was that not Sunshine Tomorrow? What was it?
Game of
What
Love.
Sunshine Dreams? Was that what the compilation is
Oh,
called?
don't need that cover. Yeah.
Blue Man Surfing. Yeah, no, that was interesting. But I do actually quite like the cover with the Hope of My Friends. So the reason why it might not sound like Bruce, and I actually found this out today because I found a version on YouTube. Supposedly it was supposed to be sped up. So I think it was put out
Okay.
at the wrong speed on the original Rarities. That's why it doesn't sound like Bruce, because it's like it's at the wrong speed. It's kind of like you remember that first time they officially put out It's Over Now, and Carl sounds like he's drunk as hell because they put out the wrong speed. It's like that. But yeah, I do think it's a pretty interesting rendition of the song. I do like the harmonies, but what's very interesting to me is you have a contrast between the Beach Boys doing a very stripped down arrangement of the song, and then when you think of the Beatles version, it's very elaborate because Sgt. Pepper's is such a, it's such a densely produced and orchestral album. So it's interesting to hear the contrast, and it's not a million years long like freaking Joe Cocker's version. It's like 7 minutes long. I don't know why that song that's too long. Anyway, I'm probably gonna get crucified for that opinion, but oh well. I
No,
don't care.
I totally agree
I
with
don't
you.
care for this
I'm not a
version.
big fan of his version.
Anyway, Game of Love. It's a cover. It's there. It doesn't do anything for me. So
Yeah. Steve, any thoughts on the
Yeah,
cover?
I might be misremembering a little bit. I think you alluded to it. I believe the letter and Game of Love were recorded at Wally Heider's studio for what was going to be the pseudo live
I think you're right.
when the Hawaii sessions didn't work out.
Yep.
And it would have been nice on a concert album the way Long Tall Texan or one of their covers from Beach Boys concert was. But I don't think, unlike I Was Made to Love Her and most of the covers that they've done on their albums, there's not enough there to make it their own. I couldn't imagine them really putting those, not that they're bad, they just haven't, they're a bit filler and maybe an audience pleaser in concert, something different in concert, but not really right for the album. So I'm glad those were left off. And my understanding, with a little help from my friends, at least from what I read, is that Bruce said that there was something that they just kind of recorded for their own amusement, just to see what it would sound like. But there was really no intention to release it. It was like, we're fooling around. Brian's got a studio. Let's fool around, see what it would sound like if we did it. I like it well enough. I like that better than the other two, because it's a little bit more, it's a little different. But again, I can see why all those stayed in the can, and I'm really glad that none of them are on Wild Hunting.
Before we move on to the critical reception of the album, which we'll talk about real briefly, I did want to touch on Lei'd in Hawaii, which was like the live album that they were intending to record, that then got canceled, as Matt mentioned earlier. So basically, I haven't read too much about this, but from what I know, they went there with the intention of recording a live album. The interesting thing about this is that Brian did go for this, even though Brian had been off the road for quite some time by this point. He did go with the band to record this. And the most interesting thing about it to me is that they really stripped back their sound on this album. So like if you listen to some of these recordings of like California Girls, which like is known for like that really intricate studio production, and then you listen to it like so stripped back, it's really kind of weird to listen to. I wouldn't say it's bad, but I don't think it necessarily works for a lot of the songs. Something that I mentioned a while ago, I'm curious, like if the band had played the Monterey Pop Festival, I'm curious if this is how they would have done the songs, because if they had, I don't know how successful this would have been to begin with. I know a lot of people say like, oh, it was a big mistake that the Beach Boys didn't play that, do that performance. But I'm curious if this is how they were going to play the songs, if it would have even went over well anyway with that kind of crowd there. So I think some of the songs work okay. If I remember right, I do like Carl's version of God Only Knows. but it's God only knows. I mean, it's hard to really mess it up with Carl singing lead. So I think it's an interesting experiment, but I can see why the band didn't put this out officially, and I can kind of see too why Brian wasn't satisfied with the performances after listening back to the tapes. So do you guys have any opinions on the Lei'd in Hawaii material?
Well, it's certainly laid back. This might be like most stripped back concert things they had done up to this point in time.
Yeah.
I guess it's interesting in a way to hear just like this stuff stripped back to like the absolute basics, but I don't think there's anything here that I would consider essential listening. I know that there's that one version of Help Me Rhonda and it's rewritten as Help You Rhonda, which is interesting. I don't know if that's from like when the live tapes or that's from the live in studio. I think it's the live in studio. I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah, I can't say I've listened to this stuff too much. I think I've heard a couple things here and there. Golly knows is good, as you said, but the only way you can screw up that song is throw John Stamos on it. So,
don't even joke about that.
Carl can sing it. Carl could sing it like literally sing it while he was dying, and it still sounded really good. So yeah. I think it's an interesting curiosity, but I can definitely see why this was scrapped. I don't think that this would have sold very well. And to answer your question about Monterey Pop, yeah, I mean, when you're competing with the likes of The Who and Jimi Hendrix, and this is probably not going to stand out in the most ringing light.
Right, and again, like I don't know if that was their intention. Obviously, this was recorded quite some time after that had already happened. Like maybe this was just like a Hawaii thing where they were like, yeah, we're gonna go there and we're gonna do like a really laid back sounding performance. So I might be wrong on that. But I'm just kind of thinking like if they were to have done that, I don't think it would have gone over particularly well with that crowd.
Yeah, I think that there's a high possibility that had they done Monterey, they would not have done well, that they just weren't in shape to do it. And, missed opportunity, but maybe it was an opportunity that they weren't in a position to really take advantage of.
Yeah. What do you think of the stripped back sound of the Lei'd in Hawaii stuff, Steve, if you've had the chance to listen to those?
Yeah, no, I played it and said, I can see why they didn't put that out.
Yeah.
I'm glad they passed on it. And I'm really glad that they didn't do a live in the studio and then dub audience on it, particularly in '67. I mean, that word would have gotten out about that, and it would have been.
They would have come off even more as like posers, like all these guys aren't competent enough to even do a live performance. Like,
yeah,
some of that live stuff
they'd have been right in the class, right in there with the monkeys at that point.
Yeah.
Hey, I like the Monkees.
I like the Monkees, but in 1967, 68, the Monkees were not the real thing. I love them, but
once they did Headquarters, I mean, the Monkees in general, I think, still kind of have a bad label. There's a book about them that they said they were like rock's first great embarrassment, and the UK never liked them ever. Still to this day, UK press hates them.
Yeah. All right, so to wrap up, I did want to mention a few reviews of Wild Honey to close out the episode. So, Matt, you can mention quite a few if you want to go into some more, but I did write down a couple I wanted to share. The one I wanted to read was written a couple of years after the album came out. This was written in 1971 from Rolling Stone. They referred to Wild Honey as a masterpiece, the most underrated of the band's post-surfer LPs, and the last time they truly rocked their asses off, one cut after another. And then there's also a mid-'70s review from The Village Voice where your favorite person, Robert Christgau, Matt, said that Wild Honey is so slight but perfect and full of pleasure. He argued that almost without a bad second, the album conveys the troubled innocence of the Beach Boys through a time of attractive but perilous psychedelic sturm undragging. Its method is whimsy, candor, and carefully modulated amateurishness, all of which comes through his humor. So a little bit wordy there, but I think he does get his point across. And I do kind of agree with a lot of the sentiments kind of reflected in those reviews. So
let's also say this: he gave an A+, very rare for him. A+.
Yeah.
And also, I know I had mentioned it before. We talked a little bit about My Spot. He also named it as one of his choices for the 40 most essential albums of 1967. Yeah, I'll just talk briefly about some of the reviews. So when it came out, kind of also some mixed reviews. Let's see. Rolling Stone, in their initial review in 1967, they said that the Beach Boys regained their better judgment after the disaster of Smile Small, although their use of pre-existing ideas and idioms on Wild Honey is less satisfactory and original than their earlier work. It's kind of amusing that the Beach Boys are suddenly rediscovering rhythm and blues 5 years after the Beatles and Stones had brought it all back home. and Pop's Gene Scolati wrote, "The Beach Boys have the audacity to fool around with R&B, a territory indeed alien to them." I don't know if I agree with that, but whatever. Surprisingly, Wild Honey works well. It isn't the least bit pretentious. It's honest and convincing. There's Kreisgau again. Billboard, they welcomed the band's return to form, but was critical of how she boogalooed it as far below the group's quality and predicted that "I'd Love Just Wants to See You" would not receive airplay. So yeah, the reviews were pretty good for this one. Definitely better than Smiley Smile. Obviously, we mentioned Jim Morrison loved it. Looking at more recent reviews, AllMusic gave it a 4, Blender gave it a 5, the Rolling Stone album guy gave it a 4. But I will say there is one negative review from our favorite website, Pitchfork. They gave it a 3.5 out of 10.
Jeez.
And yes, they gave it a 3.5 out of 10. In the same review, they gave Smile Smile a 9.5 out of 10. They said only 1 or 2 songs succeed, and the majority of Wild Honey is not pretty because of its R&B vein as interpreted by white surfer boys, including a Stevie Wonder cover sung with as much faux soul as Carl Wilson could have possibly mustered. So I guess
I don't agree with that at all.
I will say this. The funny thing is when Pitchfork reviewed Sunshine Tomorrow, they gave the whole thing like an 8, and they said that Wild Honey was great. But then in 2001, they gave it a 3.5 and said sucked. So that's Pitchfork.
Maybe it's a different reviewer.
Yeah, but I will say that when it comes to Pitchfork, the score is actually reviewed on by the staff. So whoever worked for Pitchfork in 2001 didn't like it very much. They just the whole staff reviews and then one person writes a review. That's how Pitchfork's reviews are calculated. So yeah, Pitchfork back then was kind of like a boys' club. So I guess they just thought it wasn't cool enough for them because it was too faux white soul.
Yeah, I wonder if the change in the rating has something to do with the fact that like these albums have gotten more of a resurgence and like acclaim and just popularity in general over the past decade or so, just due to like their influence on like a lot of like lo-fi artists. Like this era as a whole from the Beach Boys is cited as a very influential period for a lot of bands that followed. So I'm curious if that has anything to do with it as well. But
they gave Smiley Smile 9.5 though, and
so who knows?
What the hell they're like? They literally the whole review is Smiley Smile. There's one. They literally said they dedicated one paragraph to Wild Honey, and they said that it barely deserves a paragraph.
I did also want to briefly mention, because we haven't really talked about this during the episode. So this album does have a reputation of sounding a bit muddy. I do agree with that. And when I listen to this album, I always listen to those cleaned up stereo remixes from Sunshine Tomorrow, the set that they put out. That was around late 2010s, I think. I definitely prefer that sound. It sounds much more clear. You can hear the instrumentation more. Whereas like, the Wild Honey version, it sounds like the original version. It sounds okay, but it's definitely way more muddy than that. So I always come back to the Sunshine Tomorrow mix for sure.
I also want to say too, Rolling Stone actually, when they've done that list a bunch of times in 2020, it was ranked at number 410 on their 500 greatest albums of all time list.
Which that's saying something, that's really cool that it made a top 500 all time. So
yeah, and I would say, I mean, first of all, those lists are always kind of crap.
I know.
Just did one today of like the 250 best albums of the 21st century. You gotta look up that list. It's crazy. But anyway, no, I think it's also just like you said. I think that this is another album that kind of like Smiley Smile. It proved to be influential as like the Back to Basics. They were doing that a year before the Beatles and Bob Dylan were doing it. It's also like an early kind of like bedroom, not really bedroom pop, but like do it yourself, do it in the house kind of. And it's just like it's just a Back to Basics record. It's just focus on what this band started as, which is just harmonies, vocals. You don't need the elaborate production. You don't need all that and a bag of chips and all that. You just strip it back to the basics.
Yeah, I think like Smiley Smile too. It's a very I saw that when it was described as a very like unpretentious album. Like the band was just kind of doing whatever the hell they want, and that's kind of how I feel about this album too. Like they were not trying to necessarily like copy what was going on at the time. With the psychedelic sounds of the other bands that were popular. They were just doing their own thing. Like we're gonna do a back to basics record where we kind of lean into our influences of the bands that we listened to. Growing up. So I think it's a really cool record, and I really enjoy it a lot. And it's definitely one of my top 10 favorite Beach Boys albums. So, Steve, any closing thoughts you wanted to share about the album?
I think the speed with which it was made, which is very uncharacteristic for the Beach Boys, actually worked very well for it as an album. I mean, the songs somehow were there, but it strikes me that it was the first album in a very long time that didn't have some old single on it. I mean, Smiley Smile had Good Vibrations and Heroes and Villains, which are from really a couple of different projects. And even, Pet Sounds had Sloop John B. And they were always there was always a single in there that it was laying around and they brought it in to fill out the album. But this was done so quickly that it's all of a piece and all of a sound. And it's short, but it's very coherent, and it really makes it an album, a real piece. And I like that about it. I think it really works. It really works very well for it, and makes it kind of outstanding because it's all of one piece.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think my description of the album would be short but sweet. You know, it's a very short record. It's one of the shortest they ever put out, but it's, again, very unpretentious. The songs don't outstay their welcome. And there are a lot of really great hooks in here. Like you said, Steve, despite how quickly it was recorded, the songwriting was there. I imagine Brian and Mike were really just kind of cranking them out, you know, at the piano around this time. And I think, like you said, the fact that it was rushed, kind of the recording, does benefit it. Like they weren't like messing around too much with the tracks. Like I think it really suits kind of the R&B soul style of the album. The fact that the songs aren't like, you know, super layered or super, you know, full of different instrumental textures. It's just a very basic approach with the kind of like the out of tune piano, the organ, and like the guitars. You know, it's just a very stripped back album. So I think it was recorded very well. So, all right. So we will wrap it up there. So thank you everybody for listening to this 43rd episode of Good Timin. Hope you all enjoyed the show. I had a great time talking all things Wild Honey with you guys, and I'm excited to continue discussing the band's remaining late 60s albums in the coming weeks. So, as always, if you like this podcast and want to hear more, feel free to subscribe or follow wherever you're listening. We greatly appreciate the support as it motivates us to make more episodes in the future. Also, as a reminder, the Good Timin podcast is available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So there's plenty of different places to listen and keep up with the show. Before we wrap up, also, I wanted to mention thank you again, Steve, for joining us. It was a lot of fun having you on as always, and hopefully we can collaborate again sometime soon and hear your opinion on some more Beach Boys albums. So
always fantastic. You guys are so knowledgeable and you do such a great job. Keep up the great work, and thanks for having me on. Always a great time.
Of course, and anybody listening who doesn't know Steve's channel, definitely check out the Beach Boys Basement. I watch Steve's videos every week. Always putting out really interesting videos on not only the Beach Boys, but on pop culture in general from like the 70s and 80s. I really enjoyed your videos recently on Wings, the videos on Back to the Egg and on McCartney 2. I thought those were really cool. So definitely check those out if we have any Beatles McCartney fans as well. So thank you again, everybody, for listening, and we will see you all next time. Bye-bye.